Welcome to Stories Caf, where we brew tales as rich as your morning coffee. I'm your host for today's mystery, and we're joining the remarkable Miss Jane Marple in the charming village of St. Mary Mead for the secret in cinnamon biscuits. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of tea, perhaps a biscuit or two, and let's unravel the deadly secrets lurking beneath the cozy surface of village life. Chapter 1. The sweetest house in St. Mary met the September morning air held that crisp edge Miss Jane Marple always found so agreeable. Standing in her garden, secateurs in gloved hands, she admired the late roses clinging stubbornly to their stems, as if reluctant to yield to the approaching autumn. The Gloire de Dijon against the south wall was particularly splendid this year, though she noted, not quite as vigorous as before the war. From somewhere in the village came the familiar putter of Dr. Haydock's motor car, chugging along at its usual leisurely pace. Miss Marple glanced at the small gold watch pinned to her cardigan, 9:30. The doctor was making his rounds, as he had for 20 years, war or no war. There was a quiet comfort in such constancy, especially in times when so much felt unsteady. A delectable scent wafted through the crisp air, pausing Miss Marple's rose inspection. Cinnamon, butter, and something warm and inviting, the unmistakable aroma of Mrs. Renshaw's baking. Ivy Cottage, with its tidy garden and cheerful yellow door, had been perfuming St. Mary Mead for as long as anyone could recall. Miss Marple often thought that if the village had a heart, it would surely beat in Maud Renshaw's kitchen. Her cinnamon biscuits were legendary, her kindness to children boundless, and her discretion absolute. In all the years Miss Marple had known her, Mrs. Renshaw had never spoken ill of anyone, nor indulged in the gossip that, regrettably, often threaded through village life. This very discretion, Miss Marple mused as she snipped a thorny stem, made Mrs. Renshaw intriguing. In a place where everyone knew or thought they knew everyone else's business, Maud remained an enigma. The basics were common knowledge. Widowed young, raising her son alone, never remarried despite her quiet beauty. But the details, the small personal threads that wove the tapestry of village life, remained elusive. "Good morning, Miss Marple." The cheerful voice belonged to Elsie Hartwell, Mrs. Renshaw's maid of 15 years, a sensible woman in her 40s. Elsie was hanging washing in Ivy Cottage's back garden with unusual vigor, the sheets snapping in the breeze like small white flags. "Good morning, Elsie," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, moving closer to the hedge separating their gardens. "What a fine morning for the washing." "Indeed it is," Miss Elsie said, shaking out a pillowcase with unnecessary force. "Though, I'll say, Mrs. Renshaw's been up since before dawn with her baking. Kitchen's been warm as toast since 5. There was a note in Elsie's voice, concern, perhaps, or unease, that caught Miss Marple's ear. "Mrs. Renshaw is quite well, I hope?" Elsie asked gently. "Oh yes, miss, quite well. Just, well, she's been rather particular lately, about baking, I mean. Making sure everything's just so." Elsie hesitated, her hands stilling briefly. "Not that she isn't always particular, mind you, but lately she's been, well, perhaps I shouldn't say." Miss Marple waited, her patience honed by countless village conversations. People, she knew, would say what they meant, eventually, if one simply gave them time. "It's just that she's been checking and double-checking everything," Elsie continued, lowering her voice slight live spices. "The measurements, even the tins," as if she doesn't trust. She stopped abruptly and busied herself with hanging up a tea towel before Miss Marple cold respond. The sound of hurried footsteps on the village lane drew her attention. Maris Elenina Clement, the vicar's wife, was walking briskly past the cottage as her head down in her handbag, clutched tightly against her sedesh, glanced up briefly toward Ivy Cottage, and Miss Marple caught an expression on her face that was difficult to interpret: worry, fear, or perhaps something more complexly gathered. Mrs. Clement had been the vicar's wife for some 5 years. Now, having married the Reverend Clement after his first wife's death, she was a capable woman, efficient in her duties, though Miss Marple had always found her rather reserved, not unfriendly, precisely, but lacking the easy warmth that one might expect from a vicar's wife. There were times when Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Clement carried some burden of unhappiness, though what it might be, she could not say. The sound of a motor car engine, different from Dr. Haddock's reliable vehicle, announced Agatha Ravel to the village. A somewhat pallid Austin pulled up outside Ivy Cottage, and from it emerged a young man whom Miss Marple recognized as Tom Renshaw's, Mrs. Renshaw's son. Even from a distance, she could see that he looked drover, the worse for wear, his suit wrinkled, his face bearing the gray pallor of someone who had spent too many late nights. In less than Kubri's company, Tom Renshaw worked in London, something in an office, though the exact nature of his employment had always been rather vague. Visited his mother irregularly, and when he did, there often seemed to be a tension between them that spoke after-fellow conversations and disappointed expectations. As Tom approached the yellow door of Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple noticed that Elsie had stopped her hanging and was watching his arrival with what appeared to be apprehension. The maid's hands twisted in her apron, her mouth was set in a firm line of disapproval. Miss Marple turned back to her roses. While the mind was no longer on gardening, in all her years of village life, she had developed an instinct for the subtle undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Sand this morning, despite the pleasant autumn air and the comforting aroma of cinnamon biscuits, she sensed that cinnamon and saint. Marry Me was not quite as it should be. The roses would have to wait. There were observations to be made, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that in a village the most important events often began with the smallest of science chapter. Tuesday tea and village gossips, vicarage drawing room, had been arranged with Mrs. Clement's customary precision for the weekly ladies. Tea. Miss Marple, settling herself into the chintz-covered armchair that had become her usual place, observed the careful attention to detail that characterized everything Mrs. Clement undertook. The silver tea service gleamed, the cucumber sandwiches were cut to identical triangles, and not a speck of dust could be found on any surface. Yet, despite this perfect domestic tableau, Miss Marple detected something strained in their hostess's manners. Clement's smile seemed to require considerable effort, and her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cups on their sauces. "How lovely that we can gather like this again," remarked Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple's dear friend, as she accepted a delicate china cup. During the war, one rather lost the habit of proper tea parties. "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, gently down. "I must say, the village pulled together admirably during those difficult years." Mrs. Renshaw, in particular, was wonderfully generous with her time in her kitchen. At the mention of Mrs. Renshaw's name, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Clement's hand pause momentarily above the sugar bowl. It raised the briefest of hesitations, yet somehow significant. "Oh yes," said Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's most determined gossip, settling her considerable bulk more comfortably in her chair. "Maud Renshaw was quite the Saint Durinth. Were always baking for the evacuees, and wasn't she helpful with those foreign workers who came to help with an harvest? Such a charitable nature." Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, rather abruptly. "Foreign workers?" inquired Miss Hartnell, raising her eyebrows. "I don't recall hearing much about that at the time." "Oh, but there were several," Mrs. Price Ridley continued with the enthusiasm of Samayan. who enjoyed being the source of information, prisoners of war. They were working at Meadow Bank Farm and some of the other places Germans, mostly perfectly harmless, of course, under proper supervision. How interesting. Mrs. Clement managed, though her voice sounded rather strained. One doesn't often think about such wartime arrangements. These days, Miss Marple studied her hostess with growing curiosity. There was definitely something about the topic of wartime workers that disturbed. Canis Composure Ma was kindness itself to everyone. Did Mrs. Bantry warmly. I remember her taking soup to the prisoner of war workers when they were ill. She said they were far from home and deserved Christian charity regardless of politics. How very like her, murmured Miss Marple. Renshaw has always had such a generous heart. Wartime does bring out both the best and worst in people, observed Mrs. Price Ridley, settling in for what promised to be a lengthy discourse. I always said that wartime romances were particularly. Sound of china hitting the floor interrupted her words. Mrs. Clement had dropped her teacup, and it lay in pieces on the Persian carpet, dark tea spreading in an irregular stain. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Mrs. Clement exclaimed, her face flushing pink. "I'm so terribly sorry. Let me fetch a cloth." She hurried from their room with unseemly haste, leaving the other ladies to murmur sympathetically about accidents and the difficulty of replacing good china in these post-war times. Miss Marple said nothing but filed away the incident for future consideration. In her experience, people did not drop teacups without cause, and the timing of Mrs. Clement's mishap was rather too coincidental to be entirely accidental. When their hostess returned with cloths and apologies, the conversation had moved in two safer topics: the harvest festival, the new organist, and the deplorable state of the church roof. Yet Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Clement remained visibly nervous, starting at sudden sounds and contributing little to the discussion. It was as they were preparing to leave that Tom Renshaw appeared at Devacourt's door through the drawing-room window. Miss Marple could see him speaking earnestly with his mother in the garden of Ivy Cottage. Even at a distance, it was clear that the conversation was not a pleasant one, that a young man never did seem to settle properly after the war, observed Mrs. Price Ridley with evident disapproval in to stand. He's had difficulties with his position in London. Young people today face challenges I can hardly imagine, Miss Marple said diplomatically, though she too had heard whispers about Tom Renshaw's gambling debts and irregular employment. The group of ladies moved toward the vicarage gate for a better view of the scene unfolding at Ivy Cottage. Tom's gestures were becoming increasingly animated, while his mother stood perfectly still, her arms crossed in what appeared to be stubborn refusal. "He's asking her for money again. It shouldn't wonder," whispered Mrs. Hartnell. "Poor Maud, such a disappointment after all her sacrifices." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Clement and was struck by the intensity with which Vicar's wife was watching the mother and son. It was not the casual curiosity of a neighbor observing village drama, but something far more personal and concerned. Mrs. Clement's hands were clenched at her sides, and her breathing seemed shallow and rapid. The conversation between Tom and his mother appeared to reach some sort of conclusion. Tom threw up his hands in obvious frustration and stalked back toward his motor car, while Mrs. Renshaw remained standing in her garden, watching him go with an expression of profound sadness. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Bantry. "More deserves better from her only child." Mrs. Clement turned away from the window abruptly, as if the scene had become too painful to witness. "Perhaps we should go," she said quietly. I have a preparations to make for this evening's service." As the ladies took their leave, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, ostensibly to admire the vicarage roses. Mrs. Clement stood in her doorway, still watching. Ivy Cottage with that same peculiar intensity. Mrs. Renshaw is fortunate to have such caring neighbors. Miss Marple, observingly, "Yes," Mrs. Clement replied, though she seemed to be speaking more to herself. To Miss Marple, "Yes, one can only hope that the past remains where it belongs." Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over the afternoon substance. There had been undercurrents at the tea party that she could not quite identify, but which left her with a distinct impression that several of her fellow villagers were harboring secrets, and, in her long experience of village life, secrets had a way of creating complications that extended far beyond their original scope. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as she reached her cottage, and from Myvy Cottage came once again the comforting aroma of baking. Yet, somehow, today, even that familiar scent seemed touched with an indefinable sense of Venice. Chapter 3. A Matter of Wills and Memorials. Morning post had arrived unusually late, and Miss Marple found herself walking toward the village post office at the same time as several other residents who shared her concern about delayed correspondence. September weather continued fine, though there was a distinct chill in the air that spoke of the approaching change-off season. As she approached the small building that housed both the post office and Mr. MT's general store, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Renshaw emerging with a look of considerable concentration upon her face. She carried herself with that particular care of someone who has just completed a task of great importance, and her handbag was clutched rather more tightly than usual. "Good morning, Mrs. Renshaw," Miss Marple called out pleasantly. "I do hope you haven't had to wait too long for Mr. M to open the postal window." Mrs. Renaud started slightly, as if her thoughts had been far away, then offered a rather customary, gentle smile. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. No, not too long at all. I was simply posting a rather important letter." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "To my solicitor, actually, Mr. Pritchard, in Macbenham." "Nothing troublesome, I hope," Miss Marple inquired with a gentle concern that was perfectly acceptable between neighbors of long standing. Mrs. Renshaw's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment she appeared to be considering whether to confide something of significance. Then she shook her head slightly, as if dismissing the impulse. "Oh, merely some business that has been rather pressing lately," she said. "You know how it is, Miss Marple. The past has a way of catching up with one, doesn't it? Matters that one thought were settled long ago sometimes require a considering." There was something in her tone that suggested these were not merely routine affairs, and Miss Marple's curiosity was naturally aroused. However, had learned long ago that pressing for information was far less effective than patient observations. She agreed mildly, though I have always found that attending to such matters promptly is wise. Delayed decisions can sometimes create unexpected complications, as Mrs. Renshaw said quietly. "Yes, I believe you're quite right about that." They walked together for a short distance toward their respective cottages, and Miss Marple ventured a gentle inquiry about Mrs. Renaud's early years in St. Mary Moon. Had been such a fixture of village life for so long, she observed, that one almost forgets you weren't born. Harold Late's husband must have been very proud of how well you established yourself in the community. A shadow crossed Mrs. Renshaw's face, though whether of sadness or something more complex, Miss Marple could not determine. "Henry was a good man," she said, slowly kind, "very understanding, perhaps more understanding than I deserve." It fell silent for a moment, then added, "We had so little time together before the illness took him. Sometimes I think he knew." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had said more than she intended. "Knew what, my dear?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Oh, nothing of consequence," Mrs. Renshaw replied quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Quietly, that he seemed to understand that life can be complicated. The Peel Plumidum's find themselves in situations they never expected. Before Miss Marple could respond, they had reached the gate of Ivy Cottage, and Mrs. Renshaw excused herself with obvious relief at the interruptions. Afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the village in the form of Mr. Pritchard, the elderly solicitor from Huge Benham. His motor car, a dignified but aged Daimler, was observed by several residents as it made its way to Ivy Cottage. Mr. Emmett, who missed very little from his vantage point behind the post office counter, was heard to remark that important legal business was evidently afoot. Miss Marple, who happened to be deadheading the late chrysanthemums in her front garden, noted that Mayor Pritchard's visit lasted considerably longer than would be required for simple document signing. When he finally emerged from the cottage, his expression was grave, and he paused to speak earnestly with Mrs. Renshaw at her garden gate, even from a distance. It was clear that their conversation was of a serious nature. That afternoon, while purchasing thread for her meeting at Mr. M's shop, Miss Marple encountered Elsie Hartwell, who appeared unusually troubled. Such going on today, Elsie confided in a low voice, glancing around to ensure they would not be overheard. Mrs. Renshaw has been having what you might call difficult conversations, first with Master Tom yesterday, and now with the solicitor. Oh dear, Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. Nothing too serious, I hope. Well, I wouldn't presume to say, miss, but there's been talk of changes. Changes that Master Tom won't much care for, if you take my meaning. Elsie's hand twisted her shopping basket. And old Mrs. Renshaw has been saying things lightly about facing the truth about not being able to carry certain burdens any longer. Miss Marple filed this information away for future consideration, noting that Elsie seemed genuinely distressed by half of her developments were occurring at Ivy Cottage. It was while returning from this shopping expedition that Miss Marple observed Mrs. Clement's peculiar behavior. The vicar's wife appeared to be taking a most circuitous route through the village, one that brought her past Ivy Cottage no fewer than 3 times during the course of an hour. On each occasion she paused, as if considering whether to call only to hurry on without approaching the door. When Miss Marple finally encountered Merceland near the church gate, she noted that the younger woman appeared distinctly agitated. Her color was high. She seemed to be having difficulty maintaining her usual composed demeanor. Good afternoon, Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I do hope you are feeling quite well. You look rather concerned about something. Mrs. Clement started, as if Miss Marple's voice had interrupted some urgent train of thought. Miss Marple, yes, I am. That is, I have been there. Are certain matters that she stopped and took a visible breath, attempting to collect herself. I suppose one might say that old sins cast long shadows. Mightn't one that the choices we make in our youth have a way of demanding accountability later in life? This was such an unexpected and philosophical observation from Merceland that Miss Marple regarded her with increased interest. Indeed, she agreed carefully, though. I have often found that facing the consequences of past actions, however difficult, can bring a kind of peace that continued concealment never providence. Clement's face went quite pale at these words, and she excused herself rather abruptly, claiming urgent preparations for the evening service. The day concluded with an encounter that will linger in Miss Marple's memory long after its conclusion. As twilight began to settle over the village, she was surprised to find Mrs. Renshaw standing at her garden gate, apparently admiring the late roses that climbed the cottage wall. Such beautiful blooms, Mrs. Renshaw said softly. You have always had such a way with roses, Miss Marple. Thank you, my dear, though. I must confess, these old varieties seem so have a resilience that many of the newer cultivars lack. They endured desperately difficult conditions. Mrs. Renshaw was quiet for a long moment, turned to face Miss Marple directly. Her expression was grave, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of a heavy burden, long region. she said, using Miss Marple's Christian name for the first time in their long acquaintance. You ever hear stories about me, about the war years? Hope you remember that love makes us do things we never thought possible. That good people sometimes vent themselves in situations where there are no entirely right choices, only choices that seem necessary at the time. Miss Marple felt the weight of confidence being offered, but before she could frame an appropriate response, Mrs. Renshaw had turned away and was walking quickly back toward Ivy Cottage, leaving Miss Marple to wonder what burden of memory had prompted such an unexpected and troubling revelation. Standing alone in her garden as darkness settled over St. Mary Me, Miss Marple reflected that in all her years of village life, she had learned to recognize the signs that preceded significant upheaval, and the events of this day had carved unmistakably the atmosphere of secrets about to surface and long-held truths damning. Acknowledgement. Chapter IV. An empty tin and a full secret. Miss Marple was in the middle of her morning routine, carefully measuring tea leaves into her pot when the sound of Droke's motorwork car, arriving at an unusually early hour, drew her attention. The window, the clock on her mantelpiece, showed barely 7, and the doctor's expression, Ash, hurried up her garden path, was grave enough to send a chill through her. Jane, he said without preamble when she opened the door, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me to Ivy Cottage. There's been, well, I think your presence would be helpful. Miss Marple required no further explanation. She collected her coat and handbag with the efficiency of someone who had learned over many years that such summons rarely brought pleasant news. This hurt walk to Mrs. Renner's cottage took place in relative silence, though Dr. Haddock did mention that Elsie Hartwell had come running to his house 20 minutes earlier in a state of considerable distress. As they approached the yellow front door, Miss Marple noticed that the curtains were still drawn, which was most unusual for Mrs. Renshaw, who was customarily an early risible scene met. Then at the door, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling as she led them through the neat front parlor toward the kitchen at the back of the house. I found her, one eye, came down to start the morning baking. Elsie managed between sobs. She was just sitting there, so peaceful-like, but when I spoke to her, her voice broke entirely. The kitchen of Ivy Cottage had always been the heart of the house, warm and welcoming with its well-scrubbed paintable and the constant aroma of baking that seemed to permeate the very walls this morning. However, the room felt different still, and somehow final in a way that made Miss Marple's heart contract with sadness. Mrs. Renshaw sat in her usual chair at the kitchen table, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she had simply dozed off while enjoying her morning tea. Before her, on the table, sat an empty biscuit tin, one of her own distinctive blue patterned containers, and beside it a teacup and saucer. The tea long since gone cold. Dr. Haddock moved immediately to examine the still form his professional manner, not entirely concealing his genuine distress at the loss of a long-time patient and friend of her heart. Should think, he said quietly to Miss Marple. Poor Maud has been under my care for several years. The organ was considerably weakened after that bout of influenza she had 2 winters ago. Miss Marple approached the scene with the careful attention that had served her well in previous unfortunate terrestants, while Dr. Haddock continued his preliminary examination. She allowed Hergus to move slowly around the familiar kitchen, noting details that struck her as somehow significant. The room was unusually tidy for someone who had indeed while engaged in her customary baking activities. The work surfaces were completely clear, with no evidence of flour dusting or mixing bowls left unwashed. More puzzling still, Mrs. Renshaw's reading glasses, which Miss Marple knew she never removed while working, were folded neatly beside her place at the table. There was also a smell that didn't quite belong beneath the lingering aroma of cinnamon that always characterized a cottage. Miss Marple detected something else, a faint, acrid scent that seemed to catch at the Back of her throat, doctor, she said quietly. Forgive me asking, but was Mrs. Renshaw in the habit of taking any particular medications? Dr. Haddock looked up from his examination with a slight frown. Nothing beyond the usual heart tonic and some herbal preparations she made herself for digestive troubles. Why do you ask? Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of a motor car arriving at considerable speed announced anthracisms. Through the kitchen window, they could see Tom Renshaw emerging from his Austin with obvious haste, his face showing the strain of someone who had driven through the night. Elsie Herrito met him at the door, and the sound of his shocked exclamation could be heard clearly from the kitchen when he appeared in the doorway moments later. His appearance was even more disheveled than it had been during his visit to Dice earlier. His face was pale with grief and what appeared to be genuine shock. Mother, he said uncertainly, as if hoping that what he was seeing might somehow prove to be a mistake. I'm very sorry, Tom had said gently. It appears to have been her heart firing. Peaceful, if that's any comfort. Tom sank heavily into the chair opposite his. Mother still formed his head in his hands. I should have. We had words when I was here last. I didn't think. I never imagined the arrival of Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor. Some 2 hours later brought the first indication that Mrs. Renshaw's death would prove to have complications, being the natural grief of loss. The elderly gentleman had apparently received word of his clients. Basingen had come immediately to address what he described as urgent legal matters. The reading of the will took place in the front parlor with Tom, Elsie, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple present as witness Esmer. Pritchard's expression was grave as he opened the document that had been signed only 2 days earliest. Contents proved to be as shocking as they were unexpected. Art from a small family photograph and a sealed letter marked for my son. When learns the truth, Tom Renshaw had been entirely disinherited. The cottage, the modest savings, and all personal effects were left to Elsie Hartwell, with a note expressing Mercy Now's gratitude for 15 years of devoted service and understanding. Silence that followed this revelation was profound. Tom stared at the solicitor as if the words had been spoken in a foreign language, while Elsie appeared genuinely horrified by the unexpected inheritance. There must be some mistake, Tom said finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. Mother would never. We may have had our differences, but to cut me off and to really assure you, Mr. Renshaw, the document is entirely legal and properly witnessed, Pritchard replied with professional sympathy. Your mother was most specific about her wishes. Said was at this point that Inspector Slack arrived from the county police headquarters. Summoned by Dr. Haydock as a matter of routine, the inspector, a competent, if somewhat unimaginative man initially, showed little interest in what appeared to be a straightforward case of natural death. However, Dr. Haddock's preliminary examination had raised certain questions that required further investigation. The doctor drew the inspector aside and spoke to him in low, urgent tones that Miss Marple could not quite overhear when they returned to Thectigen for a more thorough examination. Dr. Haddock's expression had grown considerably more serious. Inspector, he said quietly, I'm afraid I must recommend a more detailed investigation. There are certain irregularities should suggest Mrs. Renshaw's death may not have been entirely natural. While the official examination continued, Miss Marple took the opportunity to Makahar's own careful survey of the kitchen. It was then that she made a discovery that would prove significant to the investigation that was sure to follow. Behind the flour canister on the pantry shelf, partially concealed by a tea towel, sat another biscuit tin, smaller than the empty one on the table, but of the same blue pattern design. This tin was all salty, but when Miss Marple carefully examined its interior, she found traces of what appeared to be a fine reddish-brown powder with an unusual, pungent aroma that she could not immediately tea the morning speed that had begun with the comforting routines of village life had transformed into something far more sinister, and Miss Marple found herself once again confronted with the uncomfortable truth that violent death could intrude even into the most peaceful of communities. As she stood in the kitchen that had been the source of so much warmth and comfort for the village, she reflected that the empty biscuit tin on the table might hold secrets far more complex than Onion it suspected. Chapter V. Questions and quiet observation. Questions and quiet observation. The morning following the discovery at EV Cottage brought with it the inevitable machinery of official investigation. Slack had established himself in the vicarage parlor, which the Reverend Clement had graciously offered us a temporary interview room in the steady stream of villagers summoned for questioning, provided ample material for speculation among those not yet called upon to assist with inquiries. Miss Marple, who had been asked to remain available, given her presence at the discovery, spent the morning in her garden while keeping a watchful eye on the comings and goings that marked the progress of the investigation. Her position near the hedge afforded her an excellent view of both the vicarage and Ivy Cottage, where Dr. Heddick could be seen moving purposefully between the kitchen and his motor car, the first person to emerge from the vicarage after formal questioning was Tom Renshaw, and his appearance suggested that the interview had been a trying experience. His face was pale with what appeared to be genuine shock, and he walked with the careful gait of someone whose world had shifted significantly beneath his feet. Miss Marple, who happened to be deadheading roses near the garden gate at precisely the right moment, offered a gentle word of condolence. "Such a dreadful shock for you," she said sympathetically. "Your mother was such a beloved figure in the village." Tom paused at her gate, seeming grateful for a kind word after what had evidently been a difficult morning. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I still can hardly believe, not just that she's gone, but the way she shook his head in bewilderment and spot. Slack seems to think I might have had reason to harm my own mother over money. It's unthinkable. I'm certain the inspector is simply being thorough," Miss Marple replied gently. "These official inquiries do require them to examine all possibilities, however unlikely they may seem to those who knew the people involved. The thing is," as Tom continued, apparently finding relief in speaking to someone who showed him kindness, "I expected to be disinherited. Mother had made it quite clear that my recent difficulties had disappointed her greatly. We had harsh words about my debts when I visited on Monday." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "But murder, very idea is monstrous," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically while filing away the information that Tom had been expecting. "Disinheritance rather undermined the obvious motive for murder. Had your mother seemed troubled lately?" she inquired delicately. "Beyond the natural concerns about your circumstances, I mean." "That's just it," Tom said, his expression growing more perplexed. She had been acting strangely for several weeks, nervous, distracted. She kept saying things about old debts, coming to about facing the truth. I assumed she was referring to my gambling problems, but now he trailed offensively before Miss Marple could pursue this interesting line of inquiry further. Elsie Hartwell appeared from the direction of the vicarage, her eyes red with weeping, and her usually neat appearance considerably disheveled. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice catching with emotion. "Such terrible questions they're asking, as if I could ever harm Mrs. Renshaw when she was like a mother to me." Tom Renshaw excused himself somewhat awkwardly, leaving the two women to continue their conversation. "Privately, I'm sure the inspector is simply trying to understand what happened," Miss Marple said, gently, "though I can imagine how distressing it must be to have your devotion to Mrs. Renshaw questioned." 15 years I've worked for her," Elsie said, fresh tears beginning to flow. 15 years, and never a cross word between us. She was the kindest, most generous woman Whoever lived to think that she's left me everything, I don't want it. Miss Marple, it doesn't seem right, miss. Marple guided the distraught woman to the garden bench beneath her climbing rose, allowing her time to compose herself before continuing the conversation. Morris Drinshaw clearly valued your loyalty very highly, she observed. Had she given you any indication that she was considering such a generous provision known at all? Elsie replied, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She had been receiving letters lately that seemed to upset her, strange letters from people she didn't want to talk about. She'd grown quite secretive about her correspondence. This was new information, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened according letters from strangers. You mean, I think so? She'd snatched them up quickly when the post arrived, and I caught her burning papers in the kitchen grate on several occasions, most unlike her usual habits. Elsie's voice dropped too. I was Sperry thinks she was frightened. Miss Marple, in the last week, she seemed to be looking over her shoulder constantly, as if she expected something unpleasant to happen. Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her expression of gentle concern. The picture emerging was of a woman under considerable stress in her final days, which suggested that her death might indeed have been connected to whatever had been troubling her. Afternoon brought Dr. Hawk to Miss Marple's cottage with news that confirmed the suspicions that had been growing throughout the morning. I have completed the preliminary examination, he said, grimly settling himself in her sitting room with evident weariness. There's no doubt about it, Jane. Maud was poisoned. Marple set down her knitting and gave him her full attention. What kind of poison? That's what's particularly troubling. It appears to be plant alkaloid of some sort, something that would cause cardiac failure, but leave relatively few traces. Whoever did this knew something about such. Ecstatic, accepted the cup of tea she offered him gratefully. The inspector has requested a full post-mortem examination, of course, but I'm confident in my preliminary findings and the method of administration, almost certainly in something she ate or drank. The poison would have acted relatively quickly, but she might have had time to sit down at the table before the symptoms became severe. He paused, his expression growing darker. It's a particularly cruel choice. Half-Mador weapon, Jane. Maud would have trusted whatever food was offered to her, especially if it came from someone she knew. Miss Marple reflected on this information while observing the activity around Ivy Cottage through her sitting room window. Investigation was proceeding with official authorities, but she had learned over the years that sometimes the most important clues were to be found in the reactions of those not directly involved in it. The crime, Mrs. Clement, for instance, had been observed making several unnecessary trips past the Caddagat throughout the day, her expression suggesting a peculiar mixture of anxiety and something that might almost have been relief when news of a confirmed poisoning began to circulate through the village. Reaction had been notably different from that of other residents. While others expressed shock and alarm at the idea of murder in their midst, Mrs. Clement had seemed almost to exhale with relief before quickly composing her features into an appropriate expression of concern. It was a momentary lapse tone that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. The late afternoon brought additional information. Through the Ville's informal network of communication, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had established Shutters as the unofficial coordinator of village sympathy and speculation, reported that several residents recalled Mrs. Renshaw making unusual inquiries in recent weeks. She had been asking about the prisoners of war who worked here during the war. Mrs. Price Ridley confided to Miss Marple during an evening visit ostensibly intended to coordinate flowers for the funerals, pitifully about the German workers at Meadowbank Hawk Farm. Most peculiar after all these years, this information, combined with what Miss Marple had learned from her other conversations, began to form a pattern that suggested Mrs. Renshaw's death was connected to events from the war years, events that someone was prepared to kill to keep secret as darkness settled over St. Harry Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with her knitting contemplate. The complex web of relationships and secrets that seemed to center on the modest cottage next door. The official investigation would continue its methodical course, but she suspected that the solution to Morrow's murder lay not in financial matters or obvious suspects, but in the carefully buried secrets of wartime that Simeon was desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 6. Wartime Shadows. In present fierce third day following Mrs. Renaud's death found Miss Marple paying a social call on Mrs. Weatherby, one of Devil Edge's oldest residents, in a repository of memories that stretched back to the previous century. Merceweather, now well into her 80s, possessed a sharp recollection for detail that often accompanies advantage, particularly when it concerned the more dramatic episodes of village history. Such a terrible business aboot poor Maud, Mrs. Weatherby said, settling herself more comfortably in her chair by the sitting room fire. Though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised that something has caught up with her at last. Miss Marple, who had come ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the church flowers, allowed her knitting to rest in her lap as she gave Mrs. Weather her full attention, caught up with her. She inquired gently, "What an interesting way to put it." "Well, my dear, there were always questions about those war years, weren't there? Not that one gossiped, of course, but there were observations to be made by those who kept their eyes open." Morse Weatherby's voice dropped to the confidential tone that elderly ladies reserved for the most significant interventions. The German prisoners who worked at Meadowbank Farm, for instance, some of them were quite personable young men, and there was a good deal of, shall we say, interaction with the local young women. Miss Marple maintained her expression of a light interest while her mind sharpened considerably. Don't think I recall hearing much about that at the time. Oh, it was all kept very quiet, natural life. Authorities didn't approve of fraternization, and there would have been considerable scandal. The extent of I thought become known. Mrs. Weather leaned forward, conspiratoriality. I remember young Maud being particularly charitable toward one of them, a well-spoken young man named Klaus something or other, quite handsome from what I observed. This would have been when exactly 1943 into early 1944, before Klaus was transferred away. Rather suddenly, there was some talk of an escape attempt, though nothing was ever confirmed. Merce Weatherby's eyes grew distant with memory. Poor Maud was quite distraught when I laughed. She'd grown rather too fond of him. I suspect Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her casual knitting rhythm. And this was before her marriage to Henry Renshaw. Oh, my dear, no, Maud was already married by then, though Henry was away with his regiment for most of that period. That was rather the point. You see, young wives left alone foreign prisoners, working the farms, or human nature being what it is. Merce Weatherby trailed off significantly. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Weatherby's daily help, but Miss Marple had heard enough to confirm her growing suspicions about 3 wartime connections to Mrs. Renshaw's death. Her next stop was Meadowbank Farm itself, where old George Fletcher, now retired but still living in the cottage on the property, proved to be an invaluable source of wartime memories. I remember that Klaus Verber well enough, Mr. Fletcher said, leading Miss Marple through his small garden while his wife prepared tea. Good worker, spoke excellent English. The girls all took a fancy to him. I can tell you, caused a bit of tension among the lads, as you might imagine. I understand. There was some trouble when he left. Mr. Fletcher Sexbury's grew more serious. There was talk of an escape attempt, but never believed it myself. Klaus seemed settled enough here. More likely, someone reported him for getting too friendly with one. Off the local women, that sort of thing happened. He paused, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't overheard. There was gossip about Mrs. Renshaw. I never paid much attention to village talk. what sort of gossip well she was known to bring the prisoners food and medical supplies when they were unwell, more than was strictly necessary, some said, and she was observed having rather lengthy conversations with Klaus. In particular, Mr. Fletcher's voice lowered. There was even talk that she might have been well in a delicate condition around the 10 miles waste transferred away. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture, though the complete solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. Her afternoon was spent in conversation with Elsie Hartwell, who had finally returned to Toddy's to begin the melancholy task of sorting through T's Winter West belongs. The poor woman still appeared to be in a state of shock, both from her mistrustee and from Reese-trustee, and from the unexpected inheritance. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this has all been a terrible dream, Elsie confided as they sat in Mrs. Renshaw's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life. Suddenly, and Mrs. Renshaw was like a mother to me, Miss Marple. More than a mother, in some ways. Miss Marple offered what comfort she could, while gently pursuing the information she needed. You mentioned that Mrs. Renshaw had salvaged you from a terrible situation years ago. If you don't mind my asking, what sort of situation was that? Elsie's hands twisted in her lap, and for several moments, Miss Marple thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was pregnant, Miss Marple, 15 years ago, with no husband and no prospects. The father was well. He made it clear he wanted nothing to do with either me or the child. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. I was desperate, ready to do something. Something terrible was. I saw when Mercer Shaw found me. How did she help you? She took me in, gave me work and a place to live, but more than that. Elsie paused, struggling with what appeared to be a long-held secret. We were both in the same condition at the same time, Miss Marple, both expecting babies. Ranshaw's husband had been home on leave the previous year, so there was no question about the legitimacy of her child. Miss Marple waited patiently for Elsie to continue, sensing that she was approaching the heart of a carefully guarded secret. When the time came, there were complications. My baby didn't survive the birth, and Mrs. Renshaw, well, her situation was more delicate. There were questions about the timing, you see, and about who the father might have been. Elsie's voice grew even quieter. So we agreed to say that Herbie was the one who lived and that mine had died. It seemed the kindest solution for everyone. The significance of this revelation struck Miss Marple immediately. If Elsie's count was accurate, then Tom Renshaw was not actually Mrs. Renshaw's biological son, a fact that would explain the recent will change in the mysterious letter left for Tom when he learns the truth. But there was still more to uncover, and Miss Marple's next line of inquiry led her to the most surprising revelation of Elmray's. Renshaw had been receiving letters recently, she said carefully. Do you know anything about who might have been writing to her? There was one letter that arrived about a month ago that particularly upset her. Elsie replied it was from a young man calling himself Charles Watson. He said he was researching his family history and believed he might be related to someone 9. The village. Mrs. Renshaw went quite pale when she read it. Did she respond to Tatha's letter? She did eventually. She spent several days composing her reply writing and rewriting it. She seemed very emotional about the whole thing. Elsie wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. She said something about how the past never stays buried, and how children have a right to know the truth about their parents. Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. A young man researching his family history. Mrs. Renshaw's emotional responsive timing of the will change it all pointed to a truth that someone had been desperate to keep hidden. As the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple made her way home with her mind churning over the revelations of today, the wartime romance between Maud Renshaw and the German prisoner Klausfeld, the switched babies, the recent contact from what was almost certainly Klaus's son seeking information of Booth's English family. All of these elements created a web of secrets that Samyani had been willing to kill to protect, but who had felt threatened enough by this emerging truth to resort to murder, and why? The answer. Miss Marple suspected lay not in the secrets themselves, but in the fears they aroused in someone who had even more to hide than more Rachel Wartime Romance and its Consequences. Chapter 7. Village Parallels and Human Naturalness. Marple sat in her favorite chair by the sitting room window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm that had always helped her think. Most clearly, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across her garden, and from her position she could observe the quiet activity around Ivy Cottage, where Inspector Slack's investigation continued its methodical course, but it was not the official investigation that occupied her thoughts as she worked the intricate pattern of the baby blanket she was creating for the vicar's newest grandchildren. Instead, her mind was drawn to the complex web of human relationships and motivations that she had uncovered over the past few days, and to the uncomfortable parallels between the current situation and certain past seeds that lingered in her memory. There had been the case of Mary Andrewson 15 years earlier, who had poisoned her sister rather than allow a familial scandal to become public knowledge. Mary had been a pillar of the community. Kay, respected for her charitable work, but beneath that respectable exterior had lurked Kay, a desperate fear of exposure that had ultimately driven her to a murder. Similarity to the current situation was troubling, though Miss Marple was not yet certain where exactly the parallel might lead. The poison itself had been weighing on her mind considerably. Haddock's description of a plant alkaloid that would cause heart failure suggested someone with considerable eclipse of such matters. Miss Marple's own extensive experience with gardening had given her a familiarity with the more dangerous plants that might be found in an English garden, and these symptoms Dr. Haddock had described pointed toward one possibility in particular. Castor beans, she reflected, were not uncommon in ornamental gardens, though few people were aware of their dead liver parties. When properly processed, the beans could be ground into a powder that would be virtually undetectable when mixed with strong spices, and the resulting poison would indeed cause the kind of heart failure that had taken Marinjala's life. More significantly, anyone with a serious interest in gardening might well have encountered references to the plant's toxic properties in horticultural literatures. Clement, she recalled, had mentioned her interest in gardening on several occasions and had been observed at his passing of spice jars in the days following Mrs. Renaud's death. The connection was not yet conclusive, but it was certainly suggestive. More important than the method, however, was the question of motive. The obvious suspects, Tom Renshaw with his financial troubles and Elsie Hartwell with her unexpected inheritance, both seemed genuinely shocked by Mrs. Renshaw's willing. His provisions, moreover, both had displayed the kind of grief that was difficult to feign convincingly. But what if the motive was not financial gain, but rather the desperate need to prevent exposure of secrets that went far deeper than a wartime romance? Miss Marple's knitting paused as she considered the implications of what she had learned about the war. Here's Marinchild's relationship with Klausva, the switched babies, the recent contact from Klaus's son. All these revelations pointed to a complex tangle of water secrets that someone might be willing to kill to protect. Yet Mrs. Renshaw herself seemed prepared to reveal the truth. Her correspondence with Charles Watson, her emotional state in recent weeks, the will change that acknowledged the real parentage of the young man everyone believed to be her son. All of these Zujuga's dad, a woman who had decided that the time had come for honesty, whatever the consequence, who would have been threatened by such revelations. Miss Marple's mind turned to Mercelment's increasingly erratic behavior. since Mrs. Renshaw's death. The vicar's wife had shown none of the genuine grief displayed by other villagers, and her relief at news of the murder had been palpable. However briefly she had tried to conceal it, more telling still was her obvious agitation whenever the conversation turned to wartime matters, and her nervous habit of watching. Ivy caught it, as if expecting some unpleasant development. There was something else, too, a memory that had been troubling Miss Marple since her conversation with old Mr. Fletcher at Meadowbank Farm, his mention of Klaus Weber's sudden transfer after a reported escape attempt had struck Harris somehow significant, though she had not immediately understood why now, as considered the various personalities involved and their likely reactions to the situations they had faced during their years. A disturbing possibility began to take shape in her mind. What if Klaus Weber's transfer and the escape attempt that had allegedly prompted it had not been the result of his own actions, but rather the consequence of information provided by someone who had reasons of her own for wanting him removed from Theria? Mrs. Clement, who had been Elenina Morrison, then working as a land girl at Meadow Bankank Farm, would have been in a position to observe the developing relationship between Mrs. Renshaw and Klaus Weber. She had herself formed an attachment to one of the German prisoners, only to see her affections directed elsewhere. Jealousy might have prompted her to inform the authorities about active vicious, but not strictly authorize such an action if it had led to Klaus' death during an escape attempt would have created exactly the kind of guilty secret that might drive someone Tom murdered decades later. Mrs. Renaud's decision to reveal the truth about her wartime romance and to help Klaus's son learn about his father would have posed an intolerable threat to someone who had been responsible for Klaus's fate. Miss Marple's needles ruse their steady rhythm as she considered this possibility. The psychological profile fitted which had observed of Mrs. Clement's character, a woman who had carefully constructed a respectable life as Avakar's wife, but who carried beneath that facade the burden of a wartime betrayal that had had fatal consequences. The timing of Mrs. Renaud's death coming so soon after her correspondence with Charles Watson and her decision to change her will suggested a killer who had learned of these developments and had acted quickly to prevent revelations that would destroy the life she had built, but proof would be more difficult to establish than suspicion, and Miss Marple was well aware that Spectre Slack would require more than psychological insights. To make an arrest killer had been clever using a method that would initially appear to be natural death and employing a poison that would leave few traces, yet in Miss Marple's experience, murderers often made mistakes in the aftermath of their crimes, driven by the very anxiety that had prompted the killing in the first place. Mrs. Clement's nervous behavior, her obvious relief at certain developments in the investigation, and her hasty disposal of potentially incriminating evidence all suggested someone who was struggling to maintain her composure under pressure. The question now was how to create the circumstances that would allow the truth to emerge. Inspector Slack's methodical approach would eventually uncover the facts, but Miss Marple had learned that sometimes a more direct confrontation could produce results more quickly and with greater certainty. As the shadows lengthened across her garden and the village settled into that quiet routines of evening, Miss Marple made her decision. Tomorrow she would arrange for a gathering of all the interested parties, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for Mrs. Renshaw's memorial service, but actually to create the opportunity for truth to surface in the way that it often did when guilty consciences were placed under the gentle but persistent pressure of careful questioning. The solution to Moore Renaud's murder lay not in complex detective work, but in the simple understanding of human nature that had served Miss Marple so well in the past. And human nature, she reflected as she folded her knitting and prepared for bed, was remarkably consistent in its patterns. However, varied these circumstances in which those patterns were revealed. Chapter 8. Truth in the afternoon. Miss Marple had arranged her sitting room with particular care for the afternoon gathering. The best china had been brought out, and the table bore a selection of biscuits and small cakes that would have done credit to Merson Shaw herself. Ostensibly, the meeting had been called to discuss arrangements for Mrs. Renshaw's memorial service, but those who accepted Miss Marple's invitation sensed that something more significant was intended to. Renshaw arrived first, looking considerably more composed than he had in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death, though still bearing the hollow expression of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. Elsie Hartwell followed shortly after, her black dress and subdued manner reflecting her continuing grief. Dr. Haddock appeared punctually at 3 o'clock, and Inspector Slack arrived with the slightly suspicious air of a man who had learned to expect complications. From Miss Marple's social gatherings, Mrs. Clement was the last to arrive, and Miss Marple observed with interest that the vicar's wife appeared unusually nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted a cup of tea and settled herself in the chair nearest the door. "It was so kind of you to bring us together like this," Mrs. Clement said, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "Poor Miss Renshaw deserves the most beautiful memorial service we can arrange." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I must confess that my invitation was prompted by more than just the practical arrangements. You see, I believe the time has come for certain truths to be acknowledged, truths that Mrs. Renshaw herself was preparing to reveal before her deep inspector." Slack shifted forward in his chair with the alertness of a professional who recognized the beginning of something significant. "I have spent considerable time these past few days thinking about the even sledding to Mrs. Renaud's death." Miss Marple continued, her knitting resting forgotten in her lapond. "I have come to understand that her murder was not motivated by greed or inheritance, but by something far more complex. The desperate need to prevent exposure of secrets from the war years." She paused to allow her words to settle bare, continuing, "Mrs. Renshaw had fallen in love during the war with a young German prisoner named Klaus Weber, who worked at Meadow Bankank Farm. Despite the social restrictions in her married status, they formed a genuine attachment that resulted in a pregnant Sadam. Renshaw started visibly at these words, while Elsie's face grew pale. Mercelment's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with unsteady hands at the same time. Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. Elsie Hartwell found herself in similar circumstances, though her situation was considerably more precarious. When both babies were born, a decision was made to exchange their identities. Tom Renshaw is actually Elsie's biological son, while Mrs. Renshaw's child, by Klaus Weber, did not serve. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Tom looked from Miss Marple to Elsie with dawning understanding, while Elsie herself began to weep quietly. "This explains Mrs. Renshaw's recent will change," Miss Marple observed. She was preparing to acknowledge the truth about Tom's parentage, hence the letter left for him. When he learns the truth, she was also responding to correspondence from a young man called Charles Watson, who is, I believe, Klaus Faber's son from a later relationship, seeking information about his father's time in England with Shirley Inspector. Slack interjected, "This provides clear motives for murder, either Tom fearing exposure of his illegitimate birth or someone involved in blackmail." "Oh no," Miss Marple said firmly, "there was no blackmail involved. Charles Watson was simply a young man trying to understand his family history." Mrs. Renshaw was prepared to help him learn about his father because she believed it was the right thing to do. She had decided that the time for secrecy was over. Miss Marple's gaze moved levelly to Mrs. Clement. who had grown increasingly agitated during the conversation's person who feared these revelations, she continued, was someone who had played a very different role in Klaus Weber's story. Someone who had betrayed him to the authorities, leading to his death ray, what was reported as an escape attempt. Mrs. Clement's face had gone deathly white, and her breathing had become rapid and shallow. You see, Miss Marple explained gently, Elenina Clement was Elenina Morrison, then working as a land girl at Meadowbank K Farm. She was in a position to observe the developing relationship between Mrs. Renshaw and Klaus Weber, and I believe she formed here an attachment to Klaus, an attachment that was not returned. No, Mrs. Clement whispered, but her protest lacked conviction. Jealousy is a powerful emotion, Miss Marple continued, particularly in a young woman facing the uncertainties of war time, when Klaus's affections were clearly directed elsewhere. I believe Yelena Morrison informed the authorities about his relationship with Mrs. Renshaw. The subsequent investigation to Klaus being transferred under circumstances that resulted in his death ends. Clement was trembling visibly now, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crumble. For years, you haven't carried the burden of that betrayal, Miss Marple said with compassion. You built a new life as a vicar's wife, but guilt never left you. When Mrs. Renshaw's correspondence with Klaus's son threatened to bring all those old secrets to light, you panicked. The poison was derived from castor beans. Dr. Haddock added grimly processed into a powder and mixed with spices. Someone with gardening knowledge would know how to prepare such a substance. Substituted the poison spice powder during one of your visits to help with church baking, Miss Marple concluded. Renshaw trusted you completely as she trusted all her neighbors. She used the contaminated spices, her cinnamon biscuits, never suspecting that someone she considered a friend had placed poison in her kitchen. Mayor's Clement's control finally broke entirely. I never meant for Klaus to dish, cried out, tears streaming down her face. I was young and foolish, and jealousy thought they would simply separate him from Maud, perhaps transfer him elsewhere. I never imagined buried her face in her hands. But when you learned that Maud was planning to tell Klaus's son about his father, you realized that the whole story would come to light. Miss Marple said gently, including your role in his death. You couldn't bear the thought of losing the respectable life you had built, of having your husband in the congregation learn what you had done. I didn't want to hurt Maud, Mrs. Clement sobbed, but I couldn't. I couldn't let the truth come out. Not after all these years. Not when I had finally found peace. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with professional efficiency. Elenina Clement, I am arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Maud Renshaw. The formal proceedings that followed seemed to take place at a distance from Miss Marple's sitting room, though the words of caution and the quiet click of handcuffs were clearly audible. Mrs. Clement went with resigned dignity, as if collapse of her carefully constructed defenses had brought with it a kind of relief. When the inspector and his prisoner had departed, the remaining members of the gathering sat in contemplative silence. Tom was the first to speak, addressing Elsie with a voice full of wonder. You're my own, my real mother, Athena did. Through her tears, I never thought Mrs. Renshaw made me promise never to tell you, she said. It would only cause pain. But why did she change her will? Why acknowledge it now? Miss Marple answered gently, because she had learned that Klaus's son was seeking information about his family. She realized that Tom deserved to know about his half-brother, and that meant revealing the truth about his own parentage. Dr. Haddock cleared his throat. Awkwardly, there'll be paperwork to sort out, of course, legal matters regarding thine inheritance and such. Tom shook his head firmly. I don't want the inheritance, seals. He raised me as much as his mother did, and she deserves everything mother left her. But I would like, he hesitated, then looked directly at Elsie. I would like to get to know you Probably is my mother. A week later, Miss Marple was tending her roses when a young man appeared at her garden gate. He was tall and fair-haired, with a kind of earnest expression that reminded her somehow of the wartime photographs she had seen of German prisoners working in English fields. "Miss Marple, I'm Charles Watson. Tom Renshaw wrote to me about everything that's happened." Miss Marple sat down. Her secretary moved toward. "The Cotillo must be Klaus Fieber's son." "Yes. I wanted to thank you for helping uncover the truth about my father. Tom has invited me to stay with him and Elsie while we sort out all the family history." His expression grew sad. "I'm sorry it had to come at such a cost." Mrs. Renshaw sounded like a remarkable woman. She was indeed, Miss Marple replied, "and I think she'd be pleased to know that her son and his half-brother have found each other at last." As Charles Watson walked up the path toward Ivy Cottage, where Tom and Elsie waited to welcome him, Miss Marple reflected on the curious ways in which truth eventually surfaced. Despite all human efforts to keep it buried, the village would heal from this tragedy, as villages always did. But the lessons about the consequences of jealousy and the ultimate futility of trying to escape the past would linger in the collective memory of St. Mary Me for many years to come. Thanks for joining us for The Secret in Natural Cinnamon Biscuits. If you enjoyed this village mystery with Miss Marple and its shadows of wartime romance, be sure to subscribe Stories Cafe for more daily tales of intrigue. Until next time.